When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. His costume is incredibly uncomfortable. I might take it off, to be honest. Anyways, let's move on to the video. Published in 1915, it follows traveling salesman Gregor Samsa as he struggles to adjust to life as monstrous vermin. Along with Meditation, The Stoker, and The Judgment, it was one of few published works by Kafka in his lifetime, and it's also one of the only novels that Kafka he considered to be complete. So sit back, relax, and let me regale you with the life of Franz Kafka and the story of the Metamorphosis.
He is Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka. Be careful if you get him pissed. Franz Kafka. He'll smite you with metaphor fists. Right now he can. He's just a man.
I took the costume off. It was way too uncomfortable, and then the antennas kept like flopping over and hitting me in the face. Anyways, moving on to Kafka. Franz was the oldest of 6 siblings, 3 of which died in infancy, and the other 3 were all sisters. He was the only son that his father would ever have, and so that gave great pressure to Kafka. Being the only son that his father would ever have, Franz and his father Hermann would often disagree, and Franz was even terrified of him. Even into adulthood, he was scared of his own father. Like, his father was often authoritative and totalitarian in the way he governed his household, and Kafka just didn't like that. And I think often it could be even reflected in his works. I don't usually like to look at biographies of authors and the way it shines throughout their work, because I like to take a work outside of an author, but with Kafka it seems really difficult to do that when so much of his identity and life is put into the work. But yeah, him and his father they disagreed on a lot, but despite this, Kafka still had like a respect for him. He tried to write this letter to his father to explain why he was afraid of him. This long letter. It was very long, and I'll read a piece of it, but he gave it to his mom to give to his father, but his mother never did. I don't know why, but she didn't. Maybe there's a reason for it, but yeah, I'll read part of it to you now. Dearest Father, you asked me recently why I claim to be afraid of you. I did not know, as usual, how to answer, partly for the very reason that I am afraid of you, partly because an explanation of my fear would require more details than I could even begin to make coherent in speech. And if I now try to answer in writing, it will still be nowhere near complete, because even in writing, my fear and its consequences raise a barrier between us, and because the magnitude of material far exceeds my memory and my understanding. 1889 to 1893, he attended elementary school. He excelled quite well in school, but he was never a huge fan of it, despite his own achievements. He said this about his time in school. Never, I thought, would I make it through first grade, but I did. I even got a prize. I certainly won't pass the high school entrance examinations, but pass I did. I'll definitely fail in my first year in high school, but no, I didn't fail. I exceeded in passing time and again. Success, however, did not inspire confidence. On the contrary, I was always convinced that the more I accomplished, the more worse off I would be in the end. In my mind's eye, I often saw a terrifying conclave of teachers. The gymnasium merely provides the most cogent example, but they were all around me, meeting to discuss this absolutely outrageous case, to wit, how I, the most incompetent, certainly the most ignorant of all, had managed to sneak from first into second gymnasium grade, then into the third, and so on up the line. But now that I had at last aroused their attention, I would of course be immediately thrown out, to the immense satisfaction of all righteous men delivered from a nightmare. It isn't easy for a child to live with such notions. What, in the circumstances, could I have gotten out of my lessons? Who would have been able to spark even a glimmer of interest? Despite Kafka's feelings about school and his fears surrounding school, In 1906, he actually graduated with a doctorate of law from Charles University in Prague. With this degree, he would go on to work in an insurance company, and he worked at this insurance company for about a year, but he hated it because the schedule just completely, he just couldn't really write at all. He hated the schedule, and so, about a year in, he resigned, and it only took him a couple weeks until he found a better employment with another insurance company where he worked for accidents at work cases as an insurance investigator, I guess, insurance clerk, I guess. I don't know. I can't speak. And so and he was just like he did in school, he wasn't a big fan of his work and just thought of it as, something to get money for his, so he can work on his true passion, which was writing. And just like he did in school, even though he hated school, he excelled at it. He excelled at his work, just as he hated his work. He got multiple promotions, and even whenever he would get sick later in life, they just didn't even fire him, no matter how many times, how many sick days he took, because he was just so good at his job, they didn't want to fire him. It was during this time at Charles University that he had met Max Brod, which came to be one of his closest and best friends. And even later on in life, right before Kafka's death, he had asked Max to burn his work, and Max is literally the whole reason why we have such works as The Castle and The Trial to read now. He was that good of a friend to Kafka that he saw his work's greatness when Kafka did not. In 1912, at Max Brod's home, Kafka would meet a girl that he had quite an interest in. Her name was, what was her name? I'm gonna butcher this name too. Felice Bauer, who lived, she lived in Berlin, basically. She lived in Berlin, and so Kafka would just correspond by letter with her for 5 years until his tuberculosis diagnosis, which made him call off the relationship. Or at least that's suspected why he called off the relationship, was due to his health issues. In 1917, due to suffering with his tuberculosis, he was supported basically by one of his sisters, Atla Kafka. I don't think she was married at the time, but yeah, she supported him and really helped him out at the time. In the early 1920s, he developed a relationship with a Czech journalist and writer named Malina Jasinka, and I keep having to look at my script to remember these names, but I keep butchering them anyway, so it doesn't even matter. I'm sorry. God, I'm not that knowledgeable. I just pretend to be. In 1923, he briefly moved to Berlin to get away from his family's influence and to just focus on his writing, and it was there that he shacked up with a 25-year-old kindergarten teacher. The name, I'm looking at my phone again, Dora Diamant, and they lived and had fun together, if you know what I mean, for a little while, until Kafka went back to Prague, where he would eventually die the next year in 1924. Due to his tuberculosis, it had gotten so bad that he couldn't eat or drink, and he was at this sanatorium called Hugo Hoffman Sanatorium, and so since his tuberculosis was so bad that he couldn't eat or drink, Kafka eventually died of starvation. Yeah, which is really just terrifying, to be honest. That's just terrifying.
I don't know what's wrong with me, I think I'm turning into a bug. I see double what I see, I think I'm turning into a bug. I ain't got no self-esteem, I think I'm turning into a bug. Bet you $50 on my man, I'm a scholar, I'm turning into a bug. So now that Gregor Samsa has turned himself into a bug, he woke up and he's a bug. Do you know what his next thought is? You may be thinking, he would want to, turn back into a human. That's got to be his greatest concern. But his greatest concern is that he's late for work. He's so scared of his boss and the fact that he doesn't want to lose his job. He does not care that he has just turned himself into an insect. Then he tries to fall back asleep, and he also can't sleep on his side. So then he starts thinking about
how much he hates his job again. He hates his job, but he's scared to lose it because his family's in debt. For the last 5 years, he's had to work. He's been literally the sole provider for his 3 members in his household, his sister Greta, and then his father and his mother. He has been the sole provider for them. So he's really scared, and he looks over at the clock. It's like 7 a.m. He's gonna miss his train, and so his mother knocks on the door, and she's like, "Gregor, you gotta wake up, bro. What are you doing? You're sleeping. You're late for your train." And then he tries to talk, but it's all gibberish. It doesn't. He said his voice sounds different to him. His voice sounds different, and his mother doesn't really say anything, in return, because it's almost like she can't hear him. So then, a little bit later, eventually one of the clerks from his firm comes by, and he's wondering, like, "Gregor, what are you doing? Like, you're sleeping in, and he starts giving him this whole thing, saying how his job's at risk, and how he hasn't been putting in the right amount of work, even though that's literally all he does is work. Like, it's mentioned by his father that all he does is sit in his room when he's not at work, thinking about train schedules and shit, and worrying about his job. That's literally all he thinks about. And so this clerk from his place is like telling him, like, giving him all these warnings and blah blah blah, and saying he needs to come out of his room. Eventually he does decide to come out of his room. So he walks over. He's a bug now, so it's kind of a bit more difficult to walk, than it would be. And he opens the door, and everybody freaks out. The traveling the clerk from the sales office is like freaking out. He's in complete shock, and then his mom falls over. She freaking falls over, and then his dad like freaks out too. And his dad grabs a cane and starts whacking him with it, like pushing him back, And so Gregor's like, like, oh crap, he's hitting me, he's gonna hit me, And so he runs back into his room, and his door's not open all the way, and he can barely get in, so he's bleeding, and he just falls into his room. And he wakes up later that night, still sore from the morning. He's thinking, like, he smells something, and he's really hungry, so his antennas are like leading him like to this bowl of milk. And he used to love milk when he was a human. It was like his favorite meal, but he drinks it, he completely dips his head into it, and he don't like it. He said it's disgusting and repulsive, so he just leaves it there, and he crawls under a couch and passes out. Later on, his sister Greta comes in, and realizing that he didn't touch the milk at all, brings in a wide variety of food. Like, there's rotten apples and bones with like broth on it from the previous night's meal, and then like fresh food. He doesn't go for the fresh food now that he's a cockroach or insect or whatever. He eats the rotten apples and the rotten cheese. Also, there's rotten cheese. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, he eats rotten cheese. Now that Gregor can't work, his family have to figure out their financial situation, because he was literally like their sole provider. And now that they have to figure out their financial situation, like Gregor, like he has like this overwhelming sense of shame and guilt over it, because he'd even planned on sending his sister to a music conservatory. He didn't ever tell them about this, but his plans are all screwed up now. He can't send his sister to music school, but he's really mad about it, and he's really upset because all his plans are screwed up. It's really sad to me, because like he doesn't feel bad for himself. He feels bad for the fact that he can't provide for his family. Like, that is his main concern. His concern isn't anything really to do with the fact that he is an insect. It is the fact that he can't work, and he can't gain money to help his family out. And it's really, really a tragic situation, Now, his father was still healthy, certainly, but he was an old man who had not worked for the past 5 years, and who in any case could not be expected to undertake too much. During these 5 years, which were the first vacation of his hard-working yet unsuccessful life, he had gained a lot of weight, and as a result had become fairly sluggish. And was his old mother now supposed to go out and earn money when she suffered from asthma, when a walk through the apartment was already an ordeal for her, and when she spent every other day lying on the sofa under the open window, gasping for breath? And was his sister now supposed to work, who for all her 17 years was still a child, and whom it would be such a pity to deprive of the life she had led until now, which consisted of wearing pretty clothes, sleeping late, helping in the house, enjoying a few modest amusements, and above all, playing the violin? At first, whenever the conversation turned to the necessity of earning money, Gregor would let go of the door and throw himself down on the cool leather sofa which stood behind it, for he felt hot with shame and grief. Like, he doesn't think too much about himself when it comes to this transformation. He really only thinks about how this metamorphosis will affect the rest of his family. Like, even when his sister Greta comes in, he sticks a blanket over himself just because he's so concerned for his family. He doesn't even want them to see him the way he is. But about 2 months into his metamorphosis, he begins to learn a new activity of sticking along walls as if he's like Spider-Man or something, and he's just chilling along the walls. And his sister Greta notices that he likes to do this, and so now his sister and his mother, who has not been in the room at all since he had first opened the door on that one fateful morning 2 months prior, when she fell over at the sight of him, his mother goes in there and helps Greta move the furniture so Gregor can crawl along the walls. But now Gregor, noticing that his furniture's moved, he starts to freak out and realize he's starting to think of the furniture as like his loss of humanity, and he's like freaking out. He's like trying to grasp at it back. So he goes into the other room. He escapes from his captivity of his room to get the furniture back to put the furniture back to where it was. But his mother, at the sight of him, freaks out. And so when his father gets home, his father goes crazy and starts stomping at him, starts coming at him and trying to stomp with his big boots. And then eventually grabs some apples and starts chucking them at Gregor. And then one of them lands in his back, and it's implanted into his back and causes him a great casualty. He was already beginning to feel winded. Just as in the old days, he had not had very reliable lungs. As he now staggered around, hardly keeping his eyes open in order to gather all his strength for the running, in his obtuseness not thinking of any escape other than by running, and having almost forgotten that the walls were at his disposal, though here, of course, they were blocked up with elaborately carved furniture full of notches and points. At that moment, a lightly flung object hit the floor right near him and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. A second one came flying right after it. Gregor stopped dead with fear. Further running was useless, for his father was determined to bombard him. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the buffet and was now pitching one apple after another. For the time being, without taking good aim, these little red apples rolled around on the floor as if electrified, clicking into each other. One apple, thrown weakly, grazed Gregor's back and slid off harmlessly, but the very next one that came flying after it literally forced its way into Gregor's back. Gregor tried to drag himself down, as if the startling, unbelievable pain might disappear with the change of place. But he felt nailed to the spot and stretched out his body in complete confusion of all his senses. With his last glance, he saw the door of his room burst open as his mother rushed out ahead of his screaming sister in her chemise, for his sister had partly undressed her while she was unconscious in order to let her breathe more freely. Saw his mother run up to his father, and on the way her unfastened petticoats slid to the floor one by one, and saw as stumbling over the skirts she forced herself onto his father, and embracing him in complete union with him. But now Gregor's sight went dim. Her hands clasping her father's neck, begged for Gregor's life. After this incident, Gregor is severely wounded by the apple barrage and can barely crawl around the walls like he used to. So now he just kind of sits in his room and listens. His family have all taken up jobs. His father is a messenger, his sister is a saleswoman, and his mother sews lingerie for a clothing store. Each of them is absorbed into their work, as Gregor was in the beginning, thinking hardly anything else besides work. They just kind of chill out at home, and when they chill out at home, his father even sleeps in his work clothes. Like, they're so obsessed with work and the idea of trying to earn enough to make a living, or the struggle that's all they focus on, pretty much, the struggle of work, of the grind, if you will. So because of this, they need to earn even an extra more amount of money, so they rent out a room in their house And they get these 3 lodgers in there, and they're pretty rude, to be honest. They kind of like the family doesn't really know how to act with them, and they're too scared to even sit on their own furniture when the guests are around. They're sitting on their furniture and they're listening to Greta playing the violin. The 3 lodgers, the 3 men, are listening to Greta play the violin, and they soon get kind of bored by it, and they just go and chill by a window. But Gregor's like, oh my gosh, he's laying under the couch, and he hears Greta playing the violin. He's like freaking out, and he wants to go out there and dance. He wants to dance the night away. He's bugging out. It's a stupid joke. Anyway, so he walks out of the couch. He gets out of the couch, and the 3 lodgers see him, and at first they think he's really funny looking. But his father freaks out, and he's like, and this is when the lodgers actually get kind of freaked out, is when the father freaks out about the insect, and about Gregor, and he chases him, back into his room, and then the lodgers freak out, and then they're like, we're not going to pay a cent for this place, you screw you, this disgusting place that has cockroaches and insects crawling around, things like that. We're not paying a cent for this place. The next morning, they're talking about Gregor, and Greta actually complains about Gregor. Actually, not the next morning. It's this night. Greta sort of just freaks out and says, I can't handle this lifestyle anymore. I can't handle it. My dear parents, said his sister, and by way of introduction pounded her hand on the table. Things can't go on like this. Maybe you don't realize it, but I do. I won't pronounce the name of my brother in front of this monster, and so all I say is, we have to try to get rid of it. We've done everything humanly possible to take care of it and to put up with it. I don't think anyone can blame us in the least. She's absolutely right, said his father to himself. His mother, who still could not catch her breath, began to cough dully behind her arm, a wild look in her eyes. His sister rushed over to his mother and held her forehead. His father seemed to have been led by Greta's word to have more definite thoughts. Had sat up, was playing with the cap of his uniform among the plates which were still lying on the table from the roomers' supper, from time to time looked at Gregor's motionless form. We must try to get rid of it, his sister now said exclusively to her father, since her mother was coughing too hard to hear anything. It'll be the death of you two. I can see it coming. People who already have to work as hard as we do can't put up with this constant torture at home, too. I can't stand it anymore, either. She broke out crying so bitterly that her tears poured down onto her mother's face, which she wiped off with mechanical movements of her hand. And so Gregor, listening to this, crawls back under the couch and dies. Rip. And now, Gregor asked himself, looking around in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. It did not surprise him. Rather, it seemed unnatural that until now he had actually been able to propel himself on these thin little legs. Otherwise, he felt relatively comfortable. He had pains, of course, throughout his whole body, but it seemed to him that they were gradually getting fainter and fainter and would finally go away altogether. The rotten apple on his back and the inflamed area around it, which were completely covered with fluffy dust, already hardly bothered him. He thought back on his family with deep emotion and love. His conviction that he would have to disappear was, if possible, even firmer than his sister's. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful reflection until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. He still saw that outside the window everything was beginning to grow light. Then, without his consent, his head sank down to the floor, and from his nostrils streamed his last weak breath. The maid wanders into the room after Gregor dies and is attempting to do a bit of cleaning, so she brushes her broom up against Gregor to thinking he's sleeping, But upon realizing that he's dead, she tells the family. The family, upon finding this out, they decide to leave the house and go into the city, They think about their future prospects along the way, pretty much, and Greta's almost like a grown woman now, almost, so they're thinking about getting her a husband. So, yeah. That's the metamorphosis. That's how it ends. On to the analysis.
I got little tiny bug feet, I don't really know what bugs is. Don't want no one stepping on me, now I'm sympathizing with fleas.
As with a lot of Kafka's works, Metamorphosis looks at a society that values work and profit over the life of an individual. Not only does Gregor transform literally in the story, he also transforms psychologically as well. At the beginning of the story, he is the sole provider for his family, and with that, he puts a lot of his identity into that, being a hard worker that supports his family. That is pretty much his whole identity, and he obsesses over work to the point that he obsesses over work. Like, he doesn't, like, when he's home, all he thinks about is work. When he can't work, he struggles to find any other identity or sense of identity outside of that. As the story progresses, he sinks lower and lower into the mind of an insect, losing a lot of his humanity with that. Gregor, though, isn't the only one that transforms throughout the story. In fact, it could be argued that all three of his family members transform. His father, who doesn't work at the beginning of the story, begins to provide for himself, as well as his mother, who Gregor claims can barely get around the house, is able to financially support herself at the end of the story. And not only do they survive without Gregor, they thrive without him, you know, and so when Gregor can't work now, they sort of view him as a burden, which is funny because when Gregor was the sole provider, he had no problem supporting all three of them with just one person, with just him. Like, he had no problem supporting them. Even Greta, at the very end of the story, who was the one who was trying to help Gregor by giving him food and all this, is just completely fed up with him. They don't care. They're so consumed with their work at the end of the story and being, you know, this sense of work and being a worker as their identity. You know, they look at Gregor as nothing but a burden to them. Gregor himself even believes himself to be a burden, which is why at the end of the story he just dies. He just crawls under a couch and dies. Like, he views himself as a burden. He sort of, I guess, you could say that he views himself as that sort of his last sacrifice. Since he can't work, he's doing the one thing that he knows will make them happy, which is just not being around anymore, which is just so depressing, you know. But as depressing as this novel can be, I think of it more as a cautionary tale of knowing not to give too much to a society that only knows how to take from you. And yeah, that's what I got out of the Metamorphosis. Maybe somebody has like a way better analysis than I did. You know, this is quite a short analysis, but whatever. Anyways, I've been Cameron, and this is the end of the video. Like and subscribe if you want to.